What is going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, we are having a look at one of Magnus Carlsen's latest games against the reigning world champion, Ding Liren. This one is Magnus versus Ding from the 2024 FIDE World Rapid Team Championships. And here we go. In the game, Magnus is playing as white. He opens 1e4, best by test. Ding does go e5. Then we have knight to f3, knight c6, and finally bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez opening, one of Magnus Carlsen's favorite openings as white. And yes, of course, in this game, Magnus is going to play an ultra rare line in the Ruy Lopez. You don't want to miss this. All right, Ding Liren, as usual, he heads for his favorite martial attack, starting with the move a6, driving back that bishop. Now, bishop a4, knight to f6, pressuring that pawn on e4. Now, white does castles. That is the main line. And now, finally, bishop e7, heading for his favorite martial after the moves rook e1, b5, bishop b3, and then finally short castles, that being basically the starting point of the martial attack these days. Now, here in this position, instead of rook to e1, Magnus does play the other anti-martial line. That is just the move d3. And this is a very quiet variation. You do just defend the pawn on e4, but it does have quite a bit of venom. Now here Ding, he plays the main line, starting with b5, driving back the bishop, then bishop b3, and then d6, supporting that pawn on e5, and very importantly, now Ding Liren is ready for the move knight to a5, chasing that light squared bishop on b3. And that light squared bishop is just so important in the Ruy Lopez. Therefore, white here, he has to do something to keep it alive. So for that reason here, the main lines for white are c3, a3, and a4. In each case, the bishop will have a place to go to after knight to a5, either c2 or a2. Now, in the game, Magnus does go for one of the older lines, that is the move a4, and this move has become quite trendy lately. Now here, Ding Liren, he plays the main move He plays the main line starting with bishop d7. Of course, the idea from white, he was threatening a takes b5, then after a takes, the rook on a8 would hang. But now, after bishop d7, the rook on a8 is defended by the queen. Therefore, white is not winning the pawn on b5 or that rook on a8 after a takes b5. So, bishop d7, overall, the strongest move here for black. Now, Magnus, what is his big idea in this game? Well, lately, the move c3 has become quite trendy here. But instead, in this game, Magnus does go for an older move. That is just the move knight to c3. And this move is not thought to be as strong as c3, as here black can just go knight to a5 and then b4, driving back that knight with the gain of tempo. And that is what Ding Liren does in the game. So, knight to a5, hits the bishop. Bishop a2 is the only good move to keep the bishop alive. For example, you could technically go bishop d5, but then after knight takes d5 and knight takes, you would lose that precious light squared bishop. That is the golem, my precious, of this opening. So you got to keep it alive. Now here, Ding Liren, he does go b4, gaining space on the queen side and driving back that knight on c3. Knight to e2 is the move for Magnus. Very interesting. Knight d5 was also playable, but the problem with that is more pieces do come flying off the board, and typically Carlsen does like more complicated games with more pieces on the board, more flexibility to do more different ideas. Now here, Ding, c5, the standard Ruy Lopez move, gaining space on the queen side, and so far Ding has played this game absolutely flawlessly. He's essentially equal according to the computer, and what is Magnus Carlsen's big idea in this position? Well, here he busted out. On move 12, he plays an ultra-rare move in the Ruy Lopez. That is the move knight to d2, jumping back with the knight. The point being, he was to go f4, opening up the f-file. And yes, the idea of f4 in the Ruy Lopez does occur in certain lines, but this move here, knight d2, is incredibly rare. In fact, Magnus was the first person to play it way back in 2010 against Peter Svidler, and he is the first grandmaster rated over 2600 ELO to repeat it since then, this being the second time he has played it. So it's been 14 years. Finally, Magnus does repeat this very creative line that he invented way back then. All right, here, Ding Liren. In this position, it is absolutely critical to go bishop e6, challenging that bishop on a2. That bishop is just too strong. It must be eliminated ASAP. Therefore, bishop e6, threatening bishop takes a2 is the strongest idea. But instead, in the game, Ding Liren being rattled a little bit, he does go short castles, and this move is very typical in the Ruy Lopez, don't get me wrong, but here it turns out to be just a little bit weaker. All right, now Magnus. Of course, he does go f4 in this position, that being the main idea of knight d2 in the first place, freeing up that f-pawn to go marching down the board. And now, very importantly, if this f-file gets opened up and this bishop on a2 does stay alive, the bishop and the rook will synergize perfectly, pointing at f7, and white will have a tremendous amount of pressure on the king side. All right, now, Ding Liren, again, bishop e6 is the best idea, but once again, he does refrain from playing that move. Instead, rook to b8 is the idea, and now here, Ding Liren, he does have a secret idea with this move. The threat, believe it or not, is the pawn sacrifice b3. If Ding Liren can get that off, then after, say, c takes b3, that light squared bishop on a2 would be entombed by his own pawn, and if white ever goes b4, then c takes b4, regains the pawn immediately, and black would have the open c file to play with. So rook b8, a creative idea, potentially threatening that pawn sacrifice with b3. However, Magnus Carlsen, he is too fast. He jumps in with his knight to d4, this being the other idea of knight d2 on move 12. The knight does have access to the c4 square, and now here, Magnus, he is threatening knight takes a5, and yes, the knight is defended by the queen on d8. However, if Magnus does play that move, knight takes, then queen takes, the queen will be a little bit misplaced on a5. It'll be too far away from the defense of the king side where it needs to be, and for that reason, knight takes a5 is a very real threat. So here, Ding Liren, knight takes c4, not allowing knight takes a5, and now we have bishop takes c4, and now that whole point of b3 is no longer valid. Magnus Carlsen has completely diffused that potential pawn sacrifice of Ding Liren. And now I'm going to be a broken record here, but once again, in this exact position, bishop to e6 is the strongest idea for Ding. Once again, that bishop is just too dangerous. It must be eliminated ASAP. And once again, Ding, he doesn't play that move. Instead, a5 is the idea, gaining space on the queen side and locking down the queen side pawn structure, stopping the idea of a5 from white. That is a very thematic move in the Ruy Lopez for white, trying to disconnect those pawns on a6 and b4. However, here in this position, a5 was just a little bit too slow. And again, bishop e6 was the higher priority. Now here, Magnus, he does not allow bishop e6 under good circumstances. First of all, he takes on e5, f takes e5, then d takes, and then the move is knight to g3. Finally getting that knight over to the very good g3 square, where it has access to both f5 and h5. That knight is now very active on g3. Ding Liren has a lot of different threats to deal with from Magnus. All right, now, in this position, honestly, there is not a whole lot that Ding Liren can do actively to get counterplay. The queen side is just completely locked down. There's almost nothing he can do there. Therefore, everything will be happening in the center and the king side from here on out, at least for a little while. Now here, Ding Liren, he starts with the move knight to e8, jumping back with the knight. The point being, he wants to go knight d6 and bishop f6, a very powerful regrouping process with his minor pieces. All right, now Magnus, what is he going to do about it? Well, he has several different playable plans here. First of all, very importantly, knight to f5 immediately is not the best idea for white. The problem with this is black can take that knight immediately. Then after, say, bishop takes, rook takes, the move for black would actually be queen d4 check, hitting the king on g1, and you simply cannot block it with the bishop, as the bishop would hang on e3. So overall, knight f5 is a very good future idea, but it doesn't work right now due to tactical reasons with queen d4. So with that in mind, what is Magnus Carlsen's plan? Well, he can slow play it with, say, b3 intending bishop b2, bishop e3, and so on, but instead, he plays the Hikaru queen move, queen to h5, and I call this the Hikaru queen move because Hikaru, at least in my opinion, he popularized the whole opening where you go e4, e5, then queen to h5. So to me, this queen to h5 will always be the Hikaru queen. Now here, Ding Liren, knight d6 is the move. Again, continuing his regrouping process with the knight and the bishop, potentially intending bishop f6 next. Now, Magnus, his bishop on c4 is being attacked, therefore bishop d5 is the move, getting in out of harm's way. Now Ding, bishop f6, again continuing his plan, and now very importantly, Ding Liren will have the resource of g6, driving back the queen, and then bishop g7 if he wants it, and that is a very standard regrouping process for that dark squared bishop in the closed Ruy Lopez. Now here, Magnus, b3, bolstering the queen side, potentially setting up the idea of bishop b2 in the future, and that bishop would pressure that pawn on e5. Now Ding, he does go g6, trying to fianchetto his dark squared bishop and driving back that Hikaru queen on h5. Now queen to f3 is the move, pressuring the bishop. The bishop must move, therefore bishop g7 is the move here, and Ding Liren, hats off to him. He has found an excellent way to regroup his pieces. The knight going from f6, d8 to d6, the bishop going to f6, then g7. Overall, Ding Liren is doing relatively okay here. Yes, Magnus is a little bit better, but overall, Ding Liren is defending like a true world champion. Now here, Magnus, I would have thought bishop b2 would be the move. That's kind of the idea of b3, but nope, he changed his mind. Bishop e3. Now that pawn on c5 is weak, therefore e3 may actually be a better square for the bishop. Now here, Ding, he must defend. Rook c8 is the move, defending that pawn on c5 with the rook, the right idea. And now queen to f2 for Magnus, again, piling on more and more pressure on that pawn. And now here, right here, this is an incredibly critical point in the game for Ding Liren. He must find the right way to defend that pawn if he wants to defend it at all. That is my hit. Now here, Ding Liren in the game, he did go queen to c7, but it turns out that is a big mistake. The computer says the only way to have a good game here as black, where you're relatively close to being equal, is to sacrifice the pawn. The move instead is actually queen to e7, giving up that pawn on c5. Then you follow up bishop e6. And the point is, if you give up that pawn on c5, then white's two pawns on c2 and d3 will be backward pawns, and black will have a lot of pressure with those rooks on d8 and c8 lining up with those backward pawns. But instead, queen c7 is the move, defending. And here the problem with this move is the queen on d8 did guard that g5 square, stopping bishop g5 ideas, but now the queen does not guard it, and therefore Magnus immediately punishes this move by Ding, bishop g5, flying in with the bishop. And yes, technically, the bishop is not threatening very much yet. However, Magnus can now go, say, queen d2 or queen to e3, threatening bishop h6, getting rid of those dark squared bishops, and that would be a very serious idea that Ding has to contend with. All right, now, bishop e6. Finally, Ding does challenge that light squared bishop on d5, the precious Ruy Lopez bishop, and now Magnus does go for the trade. Bishop takes, then f takes, and now Ding Liren, yes, he does have those double pawns on the e-file, and yes, they are weak. However, they're not as weak as they look at first glance. After all, that pawn on e6 does do a very good job of guarding both d5 and f5. I mean, these pawns do control a lot of very important squares on the e-file, or the d-file, sorry, and the f-file. And now here, very importantly, of course, the rook is attacking the queen on f2. White must move the queen. Therefore, queen d2 is the move, setting up potentially bishop h6 ideas as discussed. Now here, Ding Liren, how should he be defending in this position? It's actually quite difficult to find the right idea. Now here, in this position, the computer loves the idea of trying to improve the placement of the knight. It wants you to go knight f7, then d8, then c6, and then maybe knight d4, finding the very good d4 outpost for the knight. But instead, in the game, Ding Liren, he says, you know what, I'm going to get all of the rooks off the board. He starts rook takes f1, then Magnus recaptures with his rook takes, and then rook to f8, once again offering the rook trade. And this time Magnus, he does go for it. So rook takes, then bishop takes f8 is the sequence. And now bishop e3 for Magnus, putting pressure on that pawn on c5. And now we do have sort of a queen, bishop, knight, middle game, end game scenario, whatever you want to call it. Overall, Magnus here, he does have quite a bit of pressure thanks to black's very weak pawns on e5 and e6. And now here, Ding Liren, he does find that idea with the knight I had mentioned earlier in this video. He goes knight to f7, starting that rerouting process with the knight, perhaps going d8, then c6. Now Magnus, queen to f2, piling up the pressure on that pawn on c5, knight d8, then we have knight f1. Magnus here, he's intending knight d2 and then knight to c4, putting pressure on that pawn on e5. Magnus also finding the best possible placement of his knight, transferring it from g3 all the way to the c4 square. So we have queen to e7, defending c5, then knight d2, knight c6, and knight to c4. Now here, very importantly, that knight on c4 is absolutely perfectly placed. It pressures both a5 and e5. And for now, that knight on c6 is forced to stay there. It simply cannot move. As soon as you move it, either of those pawns on a5 or e5 would fall immediately. Now here, Ding Liren, what should he be doing in this position? Well, it turns out there isn't a whole lot that he can do actively. In the game, he does go h5, gaining space on the king side, a decent idea. And now Magnus, he goes h4 himself, stopping the future idea of h4 from black. Now here, very importantly for Ding, turns out there is simply not a whole lot that it can do actively in this position. So for that reason here, he just goes king g7. And no, this is not the start of some sort of weird king march. He's simply out of good ideas. His plan now, perhaps, just moving his king back and forth, kind of wasting moves. Now here, Magnus, g3. Ding does go king g8, again confirming he's just going back and forth with his king. There's very little he can do productively right now. Now Magnus, king g2, king g7 for Ding. And now if Magnus Carlsen wanted it, he could go king g1, king g2, king g8, king g7, and both sides would agree to a draw. But of course, Magnus in this position, he is playing for a win. He is better as white. Therefore, he finds the only good way to make progress in this position. He does go for the pawn break, g4, a very powerful idea. Now here, Ding Liren, of course, he does capture on g4. H takes g4 is the move. And now queen g3 for Magnus, threatening that pawn on g4, threatening queen takes g4, and finally, he is making progress once again in this game. All right, now Ding, queen to f6, flying with the queen on the f-file, a decent move, but now Magnus, bishop g5, pressuring the queen. The queen must move once again. So Ding, queen to f7, and now we have knight takes e5. That pawn on e5 was finally undefended. Magnus does jump in with the knight, and here Magnus, technically, he's not up a pawn yet, but that pawn on g4 is going to fall sooner or later, and when it does, Magnus will be up a pawn in this queen-bishop-knight middle game scenario, and that does give him a very tangible advantage here. All right, Ding Liren, knight takes e5, then queen takes, hits the king with check. The king must move in the game. King to h7 is the move. And now queen to f6. Magnus Carlsen here, he is very confident in the endgame. Very importantly, we would have a dark squared bishop endgame if the queens come flying off the board. And Ding Liren, all of his pawns on the queen side are on dark squares, and all of Magnus Carlsen's are on light squares. That would basically mean it would be game over in the endgame. That plus the soon-to-be one-pawn disadvantage. Therefore, Ding Liren here, he cannot allow the queens to come off the board yet. So he goes queen to e8, keeping the queens alive and defending the pawn on e6, stopping queen takes e6. Now here, Magnus, king g3. The king has now become sort of a fighting piece in this endgame, and believe it or not, the king is threatening king takes g4, winning that pawn on g4. All right, now bishop g7 hits the queen, queen to e7, once again offering that queen trade, and once again Ding Liren does decline. Queen b8 hits the king. Now bishop f4 hits the queen in return on b8. Now we have e5, bishop g5, and then queen to b6. Ding Liren dancing around with his pieces, doing his best to fight back. All right, Magnus, bishop b3, putting pressure on that pawn on c5. How is Ding going to defend it? Well, it turns out he is not. There is no good way to do it. Bishop f8 would be the only move, but that does hang the bishop immediately. Therefore, queen c6 is the move, getting out of the way of a future bishop takes c5 threat. But now the pawn, of course, it does fall. Queen takes c5, wins the pawn, queen to f6, and now king takes g4. And now here, Magnus Carlsen, the dust has settled. He is officially up 2 pawns in this scenario, those being the pawns on d3 and c2. Now, very importantly, Ding Liren, he is down, but he is not out. Those pawns on d3 and c2 are very, very weak. They're technically backward pawns, as no matter how Magnus Carlsen tries to move them down the board, either d4 or c3, Ding Liren does control those squares with his pawns on b4 and e5. Therefore, those pawns are very, very weak, and despite being up 2 pawns in this position, the computer says, you know what? This is actually a very defendable game for black. All right, here, queen to f1 is the move for Ding, trying to find counterplay, a very active move, fighting for this extra space on the king side that Magnus Carlsen has created by pushing his pawns down the board. Now here, king g3, trying to defend, but bishop f6, Ding Liren again getting counterplay. Now the threat could be, for example, queen e1 or queen to h1, threatening that pawn on h4. Now here, bishop f2 is the move, guarding that e1 square, but Ding Liren, queen to h1, threatening queen takes h4. That is a very, very real threat, and Magnus must find a way to defend, and in the game, he finds the only good one. He starts queen c7, hitting the king must move, then queen c8, the king moves again, and now the queen is in time to fly back all the way back to the h3 square. Now first, before doing that, he does insert one more check, queen d7, driving back the king to the back rank, king g8, and then he flies back with the queen to h3, defending everything just in the nick of time. The magician Magnus Carlsen pulls it off yet again. All right, queen c1 for Ding, threatening that pawn on c2. Now we have queen to g4. The idea being queen takes g6 is a very real threat. And here Ding Liren, he does not bother trying to defend with, say, queen to h6. Instead, he gobbles the pawn on c2 immediately. Queen takes c2, then queen takes g6, hits the king with check, bishop g7 defends, and now Magnus, one of my favorite moves on the chessboard, second to only h4, he plays the move h5, marching the alpha 0 h-pawn down the board. The threat now is h6, and then queen takes g7 checkmate. How will Ding Liren defend? Well, he starts queen takes d3, gobbling that other pawn on d3. The king moves, king g2, and now Ding, he must defend. The move is queen d2. If you take that pawn on b3, you may be losing the game after, say, h6. Therefore, queen d2 guards the a6 square. That is the only good idea. But now Magnus, he finds a way to enter into a winning endgame as white. The move is h6, a brilliant idea. I'm giving that move an exclamation point. The point being, queen takes is forced. Ding Liren does take the pawn with the queen. Queen takes h6, and now we have queen takes, bishop takes, and then here, Magnus Carlsen, the key move in this endgame, immediately, bishop to b6. And as discussed earlier in this video, having those pawns on dark squares means white's dark squared bishop, will be active in the entire endgame, and black's, it'll be defending, and most importantly, white can gobble up all of these pawns, and there's very little black can do to defend. Now here, Ding Liren, he tries king f7, king f3, king e6, but here Magnus finally, bishop takes a5 is the move, winning that pawn, and that extra pass pawn on the a file will decide the game. Even if Ding Liren does defend with bishop f8, that pawn on a4 is just too strong, and for that reason here in this position, Ding Liren, he resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Magnus and Ding at the 2024 FIDE World Rapid Team Championships. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button, and check out this video right here, where Gukesh plays one of his best games ever against the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. If you enjoyed this game, you'll love that one as well. So check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.